Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the third in our ECR webinar series. We have Madeleine Pauker from the University of Sussex.
Perfect. Okay. I'm Madeleine, for those who don't know me. I'm a PhD student at the University of Sussex, and I also work alongside Catherine in the place-based retrofit and regeneration project in Pier 2. This presentation is based on my paper in progress for my PhD, which forms part of the project, but has a slightly different focus in that it's taking a historical perspective on public investment in the private housing stock and trying to draw out sort of insights from that policy history that are relevant to the contemporary retrofit challenge in privately owned, owner-occupied, so housing under home ownership specifically. So why private housing? It does, obviously retrofitting housing generally is challenging. Retrofitting social housing is challenging. Private rented housing also very challenging, but owner-occupied housing comes with a sort of unique set of challenges, really mainly that it's in distributed ownership, and it can't really be regulated as an institution in the same way that, for example, social housing can. There are standards that have to be met, and there are institutions that are responsible for meeting those standards, right? The social landlords. And then additionally, owner-occupied housing, has this dual function as both home and asset. And so that really shapes sort of debates around who should receive subsidy for retrofit, support for retrofit. That's sort of framed as a tension and concern in sort of policy debates around how to provide support for homeowners to retrofit. So existing research in the English/UK context has challenged a number of assumptions underlying retrofit policy, notably around sort of its scope, its scale. There's a lot going on around relationality in retrofit policy and implementation. There's also some critiques based around market orientation and the sort of way that retrofit is constructed as a market. But these pieces of research have quite limited historical contextualization. So I would argue that we need to go back into the history of state intervention or public investment in private housing conditions to understand sort of how assumptions around key policy dimensions relating to retrofit have developed, how we might appraise alternatives, and these sort of political economic conditions that historically have led to different policy approaches and what that might tell us about the sort of way that we might frame policy approaches today. So really the sort of central point of this article, though I'll go into quite a bit of historical detail, but the central point is just that we've been here before. Sort of policy intervention in owner-occupied housing and private housing is not a new thing, especially in retrofit. Retrofit policy, sort of direct support for homeowners to retrofit, has a 50-year history, and before that, there was lots of intervention in private, in existing private housing. So there's a long history that we can learn from about how public investment has worked, and sort of key policy dimensions that are within sort of each area that are relevant, to the contemporary retrofit challenge. So in this paper, I look at the history of retrofit. So, it's a term that I'm applying a bit retroactively because, in the 70s, this was called energy conservation or insulation. Retrofit is a relatively new term. But energy efficiency measures. And then I'm also looking at the history of renewal, which is essentially focuses on structural improvements and the addition of amenities such as plumbing and indoor kitchens, things like that, to existing housing. And then regeneration a bit as well, which more has connotations around sort of restructuring housing markets. It might include improvement of existing housing. It might include demolition, but it is somewhat distinct from renewal. And so the paper does focus mostly on England, just because housing has been a devolved policy area for the last, over 20 years. There is some overlap with the devolved nations, but it would just be a bit it would get a bit out of hand to cover all of the devolved policies, but an area for future research for sure. So the theoretical perspective that I'm taking on this, I won't go into it in too much detail here, but it sort of rests on conceptualizing this policy area as welfare provision, and a very sort of historic part of the welfare state, or part of what the welfare state has addressed historically. And so the sort of theoretical perspectives that I'm working with are around the political economy of the welfare state, housing, particularly housing assetization, and energy, with sort of a focus on energy security and how that's driven investment at different points in time. And the framework that I'm sort of using to distinguish between policy approaches is adapted from welfare regimes theory. So just to very briefly summarize, a liberal welfare regime, which the UK after the 80s would be considered a liberal regime. The US is a liberal regime. So in a liberal regime, the sort of role of the state is conceptualized as promoting private markets to meet welfare needs, such as housing. And this does vary by sort of different in different parts of the welfare system, right? So in the health system, we still have a pretty universal state-led healthcare system in the UK, but in housing, it's become much more residual. So what that means is that the state sees its role as sort of facilitating private housing provision, and then it only intervenes in cases where people are unable to access or participate in those private markets for housing. So before the 1980s, the UK had a housing system that could be described potentially as more universal, more civic-led. But it's been residualized over time. So social housing, for example, has become a sector that serves, basically the only people who are unable to participate in private housing markets, whereas it used to serve a pretty broad range of the population. So that's the sort of theoretical context. I won't spend too much time in the 1830s, but just to sort of highlight how long we've been trying to make private housing healthier, better. There was a very clear link established between poor housing and ill health, leading to a lack of labor participation, and working class struggle over housing conditions. And really, it's the latter that drove the state to start actively intervening in private housing conditions. Initially, this was by allowing local authorities to force landlords to make improvements to properties. Basically prior to the 1950s, most private housing in cities was private rented housing, not owner-occupied housing. But this started to change in the 30s. So there started to be a view within the Labour Party and the trade union movement that just improving existing properties was essentially subsidizing slum landlords and just reinforced spatial class divisions. So there was a shift from the 30s on towards clearance and public house building. And so that, again, really took off after World War II. And people sort of think of this as like the golden age of council house building. And there was a mass house building program. But in the background, in the 50s, government started to sort of quietly promote homeownership as a sort of long-term way to reduce the need for public spending on mass public house building. And they started to do this in the 50s by subsidizing mortgages for the first time and introducing tax relief for homeowners. So this push for homeownership really continued in the 70s and 80s, and renewal grants, which were sort of introduced in the decade earlier, were a huge part of that. So, direct funding to homeowners to, raise housing to modern standards. So this included everything from installing indoor plumbing, structural improvements, replacing windows. A lot of what we would call retrofit actually was incorporated in this term renewal. And this was really seen as part of a package of measures to support the growth of homeownership. And the sort of subsidy for capital improvements was a big part of that. And it was, it's sort of seen by housing scholars today as part of advancing the privatization overall of housing provisions. So sort of winding down public house building and promoting homeownership. And this generous state funding regime, where any homeowner could get a renewal grant was very much a part of that project. So also in the early 70s, there was obviously the first sort of energy security crisis, and this led government to introduce universal insulation grants. These very sort of closely resembled the renewal grants of the time. They weren't means tested, they were just distributed through local authorities. And this led to about 3 million grants being dispersed from, I think, 1978 to 1987. It was over about a 10-year period. And this sort of continued under the Thatcher government. Thatcher actually increased renewal grants even as spending in other parts of the housing system was cut. But later on, the sort of mood changed around the state's role in supporting improvements to private housing, and support was restricted to low-income owners, basically only to remedy houses that were considered completely unfit to live in or posed a health risk. And also at this time, this is an interesting find from some of the archival research I've been doing. Ministers in the Department of the Environment, which was responsible for housing, and the Department of Energy, which was responsible for the insulation grants, discussed integrating renewal and retrofit policy because they felt it makes sense. If a house has structural disrepair or damp and molds, those things are usually addressed by renewal. The insulation grants were just for insulation, so ministers discussed integrating the two because it made intuitive sense. But that idea wasn't taken forward, and the systems remained separated, which they remain to this day. So just in the 90s, so the main development here is the creation of the energy company obligation, or the energy supplier obligation. And basically, this created an opportunity to promote energy efficiency policy without direct public spending. And so sort of provided a route to reinstate universal support for retrofit alongside publicly funded programs which were means tested and targeted at addressing energy poverty. But on the renewal side, universal support was removed, and renewal sort of morphed into a more regeneration type project, which was really quite explicitly about increasing demand for private housing and raising house prices, as well as addressing deprivation in specific parts of cities in the Midlands and North. So kind of where are we now? The coalition government terminated publicly funded retrofit and renewal programs as part of its very sweeping austerity program. And as part of this, it also introduced means testing for the supplier obligation. So previously, the supplier obligation had a priority group for low-income and vulnerable households. So energy companies had to meet about half of their obligation from that group, but there was still a universal eligibility provision, so anyone could get a grant. And the coalition government sort of brought the logic of the supplier obligation in line with the sort of kind of more residualist logic of the time. And since 2015, the energy supplier obligation has had very narrow eligibility requirements, which actually exclude a significant proportion of people experiencing energy poverty, because it's based on the eligibility requirements are sort of based on proxies that are meant to capture energy poverty, but don't do a really brilliant job of it. So sort of coming back to these energy security pressures that have, in the 70s also led the state to increase spending on energy efficiency support. So in this context, in the early 2020s, the Conservative government reinstated publicly funded schemes, although at a sort of much lower scale than what existed under New Labour, for example. And these were framed in terms of meeting climate targets, in terms of addressing energy poverty, but also quite significantly in terms of job stimulus during COVID and energy security. And those two sort of drivers remain major themes in discussions around retrofit policy at the moment. So where we are today is that implementation challenges are quite severe across major retrofit schemes. In in part due to very restrictive eligibility criteria, as I've mentioned, sort of inadequate support for local authorities to, really sort of like properly implement schemes. There's been a partial return to sort of universal support in the form of the boiler upgrade scheme. But this is also quite problematic in that it only subsidizes half the cost of heat pump installation. So it's open to all, but in effect, only wealthy people can really benefit from it because you have to cough up about another £7,000 after you get the subsidies. So it's universal, but quite problematic in its design. And the sort of big push in retrofit policy now is to sort of localize the scale of retrofit implementation, through place-based approaches, which is what we're looking at in this project. But that's not been accompanied by significant changes in the sort of overall policy framework. So this is just a sort of summary of different eras of policy by orientation, sort of state versus market or civic versus market, and eligibility criteria or eligibility approach. So this is still a paper in progress, but the sort of initial findings around these key dimensions of policy is that historically we've really only seen universal support for private housing improvement when it's been sort of critical to political economic agendas that the state is pursuing, such as promoting homeownership and responding to energy security crises. In terms of orientation, the sort of market-based programs, such as the energy company obligation, are very poorly suited to delivering comprehensive retrofit. So they're quite successful in the 2000s at doing simple installation measures. There were obviously problems that came up, as with any sort of mass public program, but they generally fit the purpose, but they are very poorly suited to doing comprehensive retrofit, which includes linking retrofit with addressing problems like disrepair, damp and molds, which a lot of the housing stock suffers from, because essentially energy companies have no incentive to take on those more complex pieces of work in the sort of the design of the energy supply obligation, which is very marketized. And then on scale and scope of programs, so historically, when you look at the policy conditions that have enabled really comprehensive area-based schemes where whole neighborhoods or whole streets all receive improvements, these have really only been possible with some form of universal support. And this, historically, this hasn't necessarily meant offering the same support to everyone regardless of income, but more offering some kind of support to everyone. So it might be a sliding scale grant or grants for people who are on lower incomes and low interest loans for people who are on higher incomes. And these have basically only been offered through civic institutions, including local councils and organizations. And then lastly, retrofit and renewal have never been integrated in national policy, which is problematic given that a lot of the UK housing stock is not retrofit ready and requires substantial renewal assistance. Local authorities used to help with this in the 2000s before renewal funding was cut, but and some do continue to do it, but it's largely dropped off the radar, and a lot of retrofit practitioners aren't aware that this kind of support for addressing things like damp and mold and disrepair exists. So just to wrap up, the sort of broader implications of the research, I think, are that, just as I keep saying, we've been here before. It's important to understand the sort of political economic conditions that this form of investment, public investment, has responded to. And just more broadly, if we're going to decarbonize, these long-standing provisioning systems, such as housing, it would serve us well to better understand historical patterns and drivers of policy change around sort of comparable projects in those sectors, because decarbonization, has in existing sectors has precedence in terms of the type of intervention or the level of intervention required. So I think it's a useful lens to understand contemporary policy challenges. That's all from me. Thanks so much. just about on time, hopefully.
No, you're perfect. Thank you so much. That was a really great and informative presentation. I look forward to reading the paper when it's out.
Thanks.
Great. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions if we have any. I know that there is one for you in the chat. They'd like to know if your slides are going to be available to share widely with policymakers beyond the EDRC.
Not sure. Maybe not the slides, but I'm hoping to finish the paper or a draft of the paper soon. And I'd like to maybe pitch a piece to the conversation or something on it. So, you know, maybe some sort of other public output would be, yeah, is in the pipeline. But yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Have we got any other questions, either in the chat or from the audience? If not, I have a question for you, Madeleine, if that's all right. I was wondering, as you were giving all of this great historical context, if there was one kind of reoccurring pattern or one particular turning point that you feel is really of note, or something that's emerged from your research that's been really impactful for where we find ourselves now with private housing and energy retrofits.
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of things, but the main one to me is, you know, there have been multiple points that I think have really shaped the assumption that I think we all hold now, really, that most homeowners are going to have to self-fund and self-coordinate their retrofit, you know, and that support is only appropriate for people who are low income or otherwise vulnerable. And that's not to discount the necessity, obviously, of providing targeted support for people who are especially vulnerable. But I just think it's interesting to understand how recently those assumptions around who should be eligible for support have developed. You know, it's really very recent development. You know, for renewal, that assumption really dates back to the 90s, and for retrofit, I mean, back to, you know, 2010 to 2015, you know, sort of under austerity. And so I think, you know, it's not to say that universal support means sort of providing everyone a voucher to access the private market, which is what the boiler upgrades scheme does, or just providing everyone the same form of support. But like this idea that, you know, most of the population is going to have to do this on their own is a very recent assumption, and it has, you know, particular historical sort of drivers or causes. So yeah, I think that's the main one.
Well, it's very interesting. I might also be sending you a follow-up email. I think there's some overlap in research.
Yeah,
Great.
sure.
Well, just keeping the time in mind, the meeting's about over. So I wanted to say thank you again, Catherine and Madeleine, for both of your presentations. Those are really interesting. And for everyone else, hopefully we see you for what will hopefully become the flexibility webinar, if we manage to have one of those. And if
we
not,
do have there's the
yeah.
futures, you know, there's the futures next week, next
Oh, no.
Thursday. So yeah,
Mhm.
that's okay.
Futures,
1 to 2 p.m. with the futures team next week.
Okay, great. Well, we are so hopefully excited to see everyone for the futures theme next week at 1 to 2 p.m. And thank you all for joining us.